will go ahead and take it away. Reed Dunbar.
Thanks, Kate. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Also, I am Reed Dunbar, and I'm a transportation planner with the City of Eugene, and we are in Public Works Engineering. And there's a team within Public Works Engineering called Transportation Planning, and that's where I am. And that team manager is also here. Rob Interfeld is here from the city as well. And so as the questions come in, I will probably take most of those, but if Rob has some thoughts, or if there's something I think is better handled by him, we can both respond. So that's, I think, how we'll plan to do that. I have just a very brief presentation that talks about what we've done so far. And spoiler alert, what we've done so far is that we've looked at our long range plans and said, let's build some of that based on the River Road Santa Clara community plan. And we've actually received funding to build something. And that something isn't scheduled to be built until 2025. So we've got lots of time to talk about things before any engineering starts happening. But I wanted an opportunity to come and discuss what has been done so far, and then to get any insights that you all have. So I think that's the agenda tonight. I will try to share my screen. Kate, did you have anything else?
I think that's it for now. I'll interrupt as necessary.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Great. So as I share my screen, can folks see the presentation? Yes, awesome. See if we can get it to go. So, sorry for all the scrolling, it was at the bottom of the slide. So tonight I'm going to talk briefly about the project purpose. This is a shared use path primarily, but it's really about a connection and extending the limits of the West Bank path. Talk about the partners who have been involved so far, and folks who will need to be involved as this project move forward. Project limits are where we think we will potentially need to have property, and the limits of what we build. So if there's a path, it has to start somewhere and it has to end somewhere. So I'll talk about what we've got planned preliminarily for that. I'll talk about all of the stuff that might get built as part of that. In other words, are there going to be park benches? Is there going to be overhead lighting? Those sorts of things, or at least what we've budgeted for. And then I will talk about the timeline. So the purpose is to extend the West Bank path. The West Bank path is a segment of the Riverbank path, often referred to as the Ruth Bascom path along the Willamette River on both sides. The West Bank path ended when we wrote the grant at Beaver Street, but if you have been out there recently, or if you have used the West Bank path, you will notice that Lane County has extended that path on the east side of Beaver Street up around a couple of corners. And so the overall project is going to be to connect that path further to the north. The purpose is to provide a separated all ages and abilities transportation option. So what does that mean? So what that means is when most folks come to Eugene and they've heard something about the Willamette River or our linear park system, or you just want to show somebody around on a bicycle, you're probably going to take them to the Riverbank path. It's a separated facility, which means that it's a path that does not run adjacent to a roadway. And so it's completely separated for people who want to walk or bike or jog or skateboard or whatever they want to do on that path. And all ages and abilities refers to the fact that anybody can use this path. You don't have to have a certain level of experience, education to understand, that you can walk on that path or you can ride a bike. In other words, you don't need special licensing. You don't need special knowledge on how certain things work within the roadway. You can just start using it immediately. It also provides a realistic transportation option. When we talk about active transportation, we're talking primarily about non-car trips. And as we look at things like climate recovery, and the city has a climate recovery ordinance that talks about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. One of the areas that we look at is transportation, because when you burn fossil fuels, you are adding to the level of greenhouse gases in the area. So one of the thoughts is if we provide more active transportation options, we can get people potentially out of cars for some trips, or be able to reduce the amount of trips that people take using cars, because there's a viable option that works for them just as well. It expands the linear path network. In most park systems across the nation, your linear park system, where those shared use paths are your most utilized recreation facility. So in addition to providing a realistic transportation options for all folks, it's also a good place for people to recreate. It also connects to other modes. And so this segment specifically, one of the goals was to connect folks in Santa Clara down to the Santa Clara Transit Center. And with additional project work that's happening on Hunsaker, this connection will really help fortify that connection and connect things together. So somebody living, you know, in the far north end of Santa Clara who wants to get to the Santa Clara station but does not want to ride on River Road would choose to either ride in the local street network, or they would be looking for something like a shared use path. The idea of this project is to provide that shared use path, which is completely separate from traffic. Our partners in this are many. First of all, obviously the city of Eugene submitted the grant to ODOT. And we did that because it is in our long-range plan. Our long-range plan is called the Transportation System Plan. It's a 20-year plan that talks about how we're going to expand the transportation system and accommodate all modes and all levels of ability. So this is a specific project. In the project list is the extension of the West Bank path. That's part of what we used to develop the grant, as we figured we needed about this much path when you look at a map. And we were able to calculate a dollar figure based on that lineal, foot length, as well as looking at the existing street network and figuring out how we might be able to tie into that. Lane County has been having conversations with the adjacent property owner. I have Delta on here as being a partner in this, because potentially we could get some land from them at very low cost or no cost. And Lane County has been having those conversations since we started the Hunsaker Beaver corridor study. And so far they've been pretty amenable to being able to provide land for this connection. The Santa Clara Community Organization as well has been working on a neighborhood plan. And so the idea of this grant is that we had all of these different entities working toward the same goal. And when the project appeared in the neighborhood plan, we said, okay, it's time that we can submit this grant. You might be thinking, well, we haven't talked about this yet. And that is very true. Unfortunately, the grant cycle is several years out always. And so, as I mentioned, construction for this isn't scheduled until 2025. And so if we had started talking about, and that was our next planning cycle, I mean, we don't have anything, we're going to go farther out from there. And so if we were going to do anything soon, if we were going to start to implement projects that were identified in the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan, then we were going to need to submit projects during this grant cycle. And so that's largely what got us to this point. Is we looked at the plans, we looked at the neighborhood plan as well, and we said, okay, this seems like a project that we should start aligning funding for, and start talking to some community partners to make sure that we can deliver this project. The project itself, let me see if my little cursor is working. Yes, it is. So the belt line is on the bottom of your screen there. And this solid purple line is where the existing West Bank path ends. So this is Beaver Street. This dotted orange line is the segment that Lane County is currently building. This is asphalt path that is on the east side of Beaver, and then it's eventually going to go somewhere in this area. So don't get too attached to these lines. These lines demonstrate sort of where we think the alignment could go based on what's there or what is getting built. And so my understanding in talking with Lane County is that this path is probably going to go a little bit further to the west. We could be looking at other ways to get basically back into the street network through private property, largely being Delta in this area. And so that's what we're looking at, is putting a shared use path somewhere in the space between the existing street network and then re-emerging onto the existing street network, and then eventually ending up in the Madison Middle School site, where there's also a community park being built. And I talked with Parks and Open Space today, and they are working on the planning drawings for that and hope to have a 30% drawing set out very soon. So folks who are sitting on the board, take note of that, and probably want to have somebody come and present to you very soon if they haven't done that already. But there's going to be a lot of destinations here just north of Wilkes. There's already the middle school. There's going to be a community center eventually, but there's going to be a community park up there with some play space and some other things that are going to attract a lot of folks. And we would like to be able to make the West Bank path part of the route making, or at least a choice for people to decide to take when they're going up there for events or activities. So this is the extent of that project. As I mentioned, this southern part in orange is what's getting constructed right now. That's the West Bank path where it used to end, up into Hunsaker a little bit. And then as part of that county project, they'll also be building, and I went up there earlier today, but I didn't see the flashing yellow beacon, but that's supposed to happen over here at Taito. And then in 2025, we'll come back in and tie into that network with something that goes to the north. So as I mentioned, the sorts of what I call facilities, but the stuff that is going to end up built there, I think, based on where we start and where we end up, it's probably going to include a shared use path. The shared use path, as I mentioned, just like the riverbank path, is generally 10 to 12 feet wide, generally made of concrete, although we just redid the West Bank path through the River Road area in asphalt, so that some kind of durable ADA compliant material that allows folks to have access year round. In other words, it won't get muddy in the winter. And then generally we have some shoulder space there so that if somebody falls off the path, they don't run into a tree right away. And then generally we'll have some overhead lighting, and that's something that we can talk about. For folks who are worried about overhead lighting, I will say that on the West Bank path, the portion that just got rebuilt and opened up earlier in 2021, those lights shut off overnight. So hopefully some of you have noticed that between midnight and 4 a.m. there's actually no overhead lighting at all. And that was something that came directly from the neighbors who are adjacent to the path. They said, why does this thing have to be on all the time? And so as we start to go into areas that are less developed or that are people's backyards, we start thinking about these various project elements and how we can make sure that they work for everybody. Once we go from the shared use path environment, which is completely separated from automobiles, we end up back on the street network. And so one of those facility types is called a bicycle boulevard or a neighborhood greenway. Basically, that's a low speed, low volume local street that provides connectivity to some place. And what we've drawn so far, that would be Admiral Street. And then it would sort of jog onto River Loop One, and then it would sort of head north on Alameda. Alameda has a sidewalk on the west side from Wilkes down to River Loop One, but Admiral does not have sidewalks at all. And so we also put some funding in for sidewalk for one side of the street on Admiral. And I know there's been a lot of concerns about what that might do to people's property. If they have plantings there, what does that do? And I think there's going to be a lot of questions about that, and we can get into that. But so far, we've only got funding for one side of sidewalk, and that is specifically so that if there are people walking on the path, Often what we'll hear is when we have a sort of a shared road environment, people walking don't generally feel comfortable there because they're sharing it with cars. They want that separated facility. And so that's what the sidewalk would provide. And that's why we added it. And then lastly, I mentioned some of those crossings. So eventually you'll have to get across Wilkes, and eventually you'll have to get across River Loop One. And generally we would just do an enhanced pedestrian crossing. And so what that means is we would actually put some striping down to show where the crosswalk is located. We would do some overhead lighting to illuminate that so that folks could see if there was anybody near the crosswalk in nighttime hours. And then you also put pedestrian warning signs on each side of it. And that's the minimum treatment. We can also do pedestrian crossing islands. We can also do curb extensions to decrease the crossing distance. Curb extensions to decrease the crossing distance. We could also put yellow flashing lights like there are on River Road so that you can alert people operating on a street like Wilkes, for example, that somebody wishes to use the crosswalk or there's somebody present or in the area. We've budgeted for all of that as part of this estimate. And so that'll be something we talk about with you folks as we start the planning process. And on that note, I know that when the county started building the path extension, a lot of folks were like, okay, well, where's this going to end? And how do we end up, on the north end? And that brought up this project. But we hadn't intended to start this project until 2023. And so the planning process for this really isn't starting until 2023, but I wanted to be available for this meeting to allay any concerns you have about things like annexation or any other rumors that are going around, just to let you know where we are right now. So if we start that planning process in 2023, we talk about what sorts of facilities are going to happen. We talk about where the shared use path is going to join the street. We talk about those crossings of the street and what those could be. We talk about if there's overhead lighting. All of that stuff is 2023. In 2024, we get out there, we do the environmental surveys, we figure out where the alignments can go, we figure out if we're going to power those lights, how to do that. We could also make them solar. Those types of analysis don't really start happening until 2024. So if people have detailed questions about the alignment, where the path goes, we haven't started that work yet because this is out into the future yet. And then ideally, we would bid that project to a private developer who would develop that path for us and install all of the elements that we talk about as a group. And that construction would start in 2025. We haven't talked at all about whether that's the beginning of 2025 or the end of 2025, but just somewhere in that area. And depending on how many things are in front of this project, that timeline could slide a little bit. But right now we've said that this should be a 2025 project. So with all of that in mind, I will stop sharing my screen. And I see that there are some questions in the chat box. So let me stop sharing. And I am back. So Kate, are you gonna read some questions for me?
That's going to be Gary Holiski who's wrangling the questions. So you don't need to wait for an answer. Any thought, concern, question you have, you just put it in the chat feature and Gary will make sure that it gets in the queue and gets asked for everybody.
Okay. Why down Alameda and Admiral? Why not south on River Loop One from Wilkes, continuing south on Zane, which is just over a little ways, and then connecting to Echo Lane? This would eliminate running it through established streets. Even better yet, run it down Hunsaker from River Road.
So I saw that in an email that had come to me. Zane does make sense when you look at the map, and that should be something that we talk about. The reason that we started with Admiral and with Alameda is because Alameda is where the existing crosswalk across Wilkes is and where it joins directly into Madison Middle School. So if you start with that as the starting point and the shared use path that is on the north side of Wilkes, which also ends basically at Alameda, and you know that you have to go south from there, you're on Alameda. If you continue to draw that line to the south to get to the path, you end up on Admiral. Alameda also has an existing sidewalk on it. I don't think the other options mentioned do. Maybe Zane does, but River Loop does not. And then Admiral as I mentioned, just it's a matter of trying to connect a point to a point. I also like the idea from a user perspective that you wouldn't have to go past anything and then redirect. So in other words, if the path were to go straight up from where Lane County is going to end it, you could get right to Madison Middle School, and the community park is going to be just to the east of that. So if your destination was Madison Middle School and we ran you over to Zane to get there, then you'd potentially have to backtrack to get to Madison Middle School. And generally, when we build a path alignment, if there's a street that comes close to the path, we're generally going to build an access way to that street anyway. So even if we go all the way up to Zane, it's unlikely that we would not connect also to Admiral. And so the most efficient way to do this and the least expensive way to do this is to run the path segment directly to Admiral. So that was our decision-making process.
Okay. This is actually, it has to do with the Hunsaker part that's already been done, which is a Lane County project. But do you happen to know if there'll be vegetation planted between the Beaver-Hunsaker roads and the multi-use path that is being constructed right now? Right now, it looks like gravel.
Yeah, to be frank, it was meant to be there potentially short term. There are larger ODOT projects in the works that are looking at the entire project area. And so it could be that if there is a new bridge across the Willamette built, for example, that bridge will land somewhere that is going to disrupt the existing path system on Division, including this new path we just built on Beaver. And so it made sense to get something there now to forge that connection, that extension from the West Bank path, and then to be able to come back to it when we know what the long-term plans are. And I think Rob can talk a little bit more about where we are in that planning stage, but I think that's the gist of it. And I don't know if there's going to be plantings in there, but that's something that we can follow up with Lane County about.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I don't know if you've had ODOT come to one of your meetings before to talk about the Beltline planning process, but they are finishing up the environmental studies that need to be done for a large transportation project to get built. And you're familiar, I'm sure, with the work that ODOT's been doing at the Delta Beltline interchange, which is really seen as the first phase of a much larger project. The next phase after that will be a new Delta bridge over Beltline. And then the next phase after that, now these additional phases are not yet funded for construction, but then the next phase after that would be building what we call a local arterial bridge over the river that would connect Division to Green Acres. I'm not sure at what point it would impact the new path, but as Reed said, if this all gets built out, it would impact the new path. The other thing I'll say is that, as some of you may be aware, there was a woman named Irene Ferguson killed walking along Hunsaker a couple of years ago, and Lane County felt a sense of urgency to get pedestrian facilities built on Beaver and Hunsaker, even if they're temporary. So that was really the genesis for why that path is being built. And then the additional protected walking way with the flexible bollards. I don't know if that's been constructed yet, but that's part of what Lane County's working on, and the crossing that Reed referenced earlier.
I'm going to jump back. I'm going to ask two questions that have to do with something we just talked about as far as Admiral and Alameda. Why wasn't this plan discussed with the homeowners / taxpayers on Admiral before it was developed? And what if the residents on Alameda and Admiral don't want the path on their streets?
So as I mentioned, this is part of several planning documents, and there were public processes for that. I know that not everybody can engage in those processes. So what we do is we start off with a preliminary alignment and say, let's try to get from here to here. And so that's what we've done so far. When we start the planning process, I think we can get more into what's the appropriate connection. It could be that it's not Admiral, though when I look at a map, it does seem to be, there could be environmental reasons or other reasons why Admiral is not appropriate for this type of connection. I will say that as the and we're not, well, Admiral is actually currently a Lane County street, and so we are not the controlling agency or the road authority for that street, but we have talked to Lane County about this connection, and they are supportive of the connection. And at this point, we are still pre-planning. We haven't planned it yet, but because of this funding cycle, which is again 5 years out from when we have to submit the planning applications, and because there was a lot of enthusiasm for this connection during the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan, which I think everybody on this call was invited to, we felt comfortable that this is something that we could move forward with, at least from the preliminary planning phase. And as I mentioned, we can go back and figure out what the appropriate alignments are, but at this point, we are looking to land the shared use path somewhere within the existing street network, and we haven't identified where that street is. We've simply said it seems most efficient to do it this way along this alignment, and that is as far as we have got.
Okay, a couple of sort of traffic safety issues, and I'll ask the two questions one after another. Wilkes into River Loop One can be a drag strip at times. Is there any thought on how to slow down traffic? Let's just go with that one for now. There's one.
Well, that goes into those enhanced crossings that I talked about. So most folks on this call, I think, are familiar with River Road and those yellow flashing pedestrian beacons, which work on River Road, which carries a lot more traffic than anything than Wilkes or River Loop One, are effective in slowing people down and getting good compliance. If we need to do additional work to slow those streets down, there are measures that we can take. And I think that that's something that could be identified through the public involvement process, which we, again, plan to start in 2023. But there are tools that we can use to make sure that the street is operating the way that we think it should, and that it's operating at its in a safe way. And if speeding ends up being something that is deteriorating the sense of comfort for these new facilities, and as a result, people don't want to use them or have a lot of concern about what's being constructed, at that point, we would look at how to treat the street itself and see if there are interventions that would be appropriate.
To be a little more specific, like some of the kinds of things are like things like speed humps. They don't have to be as abrupt as a speed hump is, although those are the most effective at slowing down cars. But there's things called speed cushions, which have slots in them for fire engines and ambulances. And there's different kinds of ways to slow down traffic. And that's definitely something we would engage in the community and have a discussion about what makes the most sense for your streets.
And here's another one. As a dedicated non-motorized path terminates on a residential street, how does the city plan to address the increased potential for pedestrian vehicle crashes on a Lane County street? You might have just addressed most of that.
Yeah, I guess I would say that that's why we added the sidewalk, is to give people walking an option that is separated from traffic. And Admiral, I think I counted 48 residences, I think, on that street. So that is a very low volume of cars. If every one of those houses had a car leaving the driveway every hour, that's still not a lot of cars. And so there's actually not that much conflict there. There shouldn't be cars operating in both directions and a cyclist at the same time, given how many properties are located on that street segment. Having said that, if we could go out and monitor, how traffic functions there too. But generally speaking, those access ways that then connect to the local street network are some of our best and most utilized active transportation connections. So folks feel best when they're operating on those slow speed and low volume neighborhood streets that are these very short connections between destinations. So there's not actually all that much distance between where a shared use path would terminate and where, say, Madison Middle School or the community park would start. And there's just a local street network in between there, and we would have to figure out a way to provide the best connection using what's there. Again, we're proposing a sidewalk at a minimum, and if we need to treat the street in some way to identify where bikes operate separate from cars, then that's certainly something that we could look into.
There are a lot of issues here. A lot of people just really concerned about the traffic and traffic calming devices. I'm just going to throw this in here. I think you've covered it. All the traffic calming measures you noted for River Loop One don't take people's behavior into account, speeding, cell phone use, etc. That stretch is a terrible choke point and very dangerous. That's a pretty common theme looking up and down here. Who will pay for the installation of sidewalks and replacement of retaining walls?
So we have put funding in to build sidewalks at no cost to property owners. That also includes if the sidewalk crosses a driveway, that we would rebuild the driveway apron. And if there are slopes there and there are retaining walls, we generally replace those as part of the project as well. In other words, there should be no cost borne upon the property owners for sidewalk installation at all. We've accounted for what we think is a decent estimate and can bring additional monies to this project as needed. So the answer should be zero out of pocket for residents located adjacent to where the sidewalks would potentially be located.
This might start a battle on Admiral Street. Which side of the street is being considered for sidewalks on Admiral?
That we have not talked about. We haven't talked about that at all. We said at a minimum, one side should probably have it. So that's the funding that we have. I think that's part of the public involvement process. Let's talk about what makes more sense. I don't know, and we don't have a preference at this point.
Just scrolling through there to see.
I just want to add one more thing about sidewalks. There was a project that Lane County built on, I think, Hyacinth Street, where they built the sidewalk in the street rather than behind the curb. And so that's a tool too. Like if the conditions are such that from an engineering perspective, it makes more sense to build it in the street and the street can accommodate that narrowing, that's a tool we can look at too. If I saw someone said something about some of the grade challenges. So just want to put that out.
Yeah, in other words, what Rob said is we would actually move the whole curb over into basically where the parking lane is and then build the sidewalk there. So it's still grade separated and it's still separated from traffic. And it potentially wouldn't disturb anybody's property at all. And the other part of what he said is let's look at how much space is needed for travel lanes and for parking. We may decide that we want to maintain as much parking as we can. But all of those are part of that evaluation process. So we do have a lot of options there to consider.
Instead of going down an established residential street, why not follow the river? Come to Chapman Drive, which connects the river loop right by the park to come. Delta can donate the land.
Awesome. Yeah, you should start talking to them about that. That would be ideal. I mean, obviously we'd love to keep the river path along the river, but they're not done with that property yet and probably won't be for a very long time. I haven't looked at the reclamation plan, but those are generally 50-year plans. And there's going to be some time yet where we're not going to be able to have access to the river. So we're trying to be opportunistic. We're trying to get something built. We're trying to be responsive to the neighborhood as part of their neighborhood plan. And we see a great opportunity here to connect a new destination and a new community park, as well as an existing middle school, to what I think is one of our crown jewels in Eugene, which is the Ruth Bascom Riverbank Path System. So all of those things I think are worth exploring now instead of waiting for the ideal. So let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. This will work fine. And eventually, if we can get access to that river, we will look at that opportunity if it ever comes.
I just want to add the Santa Clara Community Organization has had several meetings with them in Lane County regarding that, going back at least 10 years. So if anybody that's really concerned wants to get involved, we would welcome you. How are you going to keep people on your path when they can use Baywood River Loop One going east and west and Alameda?
So we build shared use paths for that all ages and abilities, separated facilities sort of comfort level. So there are folks who will feel comfortable riding on any street. Folks right now, some of them feel comfortable riding on River Road. Other folks have various levels of comfort riding on different streets. Some folks don't do that at all right now because they don't like riding their bike on any of those streets. And that's really who the path is for. The path is about providing an option that we think is the best option for most people. And so those people would be attracted to a shared use path environment. And for folks who want to use other streets, then they can go ahead and do that. That's fine, but we're trying to provide an all ages and abilities path network that is ADA compliant and provides destinations that people want to get to. So that's the focus of the project.
All right, here's someone who's excited to see the bike path extend north. I use my bicycle for commuting a lot, and we also heard from a lot of Santa Clara residents about the need for a bike path further north. This project will be good for increasing active transportation options. In most of these are lumped together, and so we've talked about a lot of these things. I just want to let people know that this meeting is being recorded, so we'll have that available, and we'll also provide emails of Reed to email when we're done, and the Santa Clara Community Organization. Let me scroll to the bottom, see if you just jumped in there. You talked about Delta Sand and Gravel, the future. Why is it not being connected along the river? Termination point for non-motorized dedicated river trail, a residential straight that connects to other rural. It starts off with HY. HY is the termination point for a non-motorized dedicated river trail, a residential street that connects to other rural Lane County roads, which also lack sidewalks and dedicated bicycle lanes.
I think that was going to be why, maybe the
Why?
W
Okay.
on there.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, the low speed, low volume streets or local streets are generally very comfortable for people to walk and bike on. As I mentioned, this is a street that terminates. It isn't a very long block. There are about 50 homes on it. That does not produce a lot of traffic. I mean, when we look at traffic and interventions for traffic calming and those sorts of things, like we start, at like 1,000 trips a day. Like you're not coming anywhere near that. It's very low volume, and as a consequence of that, it's generally very comfortable because the incidence of somebody riding and somebody biking at the same time on a street with this little volume that doesn't connect to like a major destination or major employment center is very low. And so it will feel very comfortable for most people to ride on. In fact, that's why we have this typology of street called the neighborhood greenway, is because a lot of those local streets, when put together, make very good bicycle networks. In fact, the way that folks get from Hunsaker to Wilkes right now is via local streets, a lot of them, and they work very well for a lot of folks. And so this is that same sort of idea, is let's put some of those together and then let's solve the barriers. So the barrier would be crossing River Loop One, making folks feel comfortable there. So we would enhance a crossing at that location and doing the same thing on Wilkes. And so those two barriers from the local street network that cross something that is a little bit higher volume and a little bit higher speed should make this feel very comfortable for most folks to operate on. And then if we also add the sidewalk, then we've taken care of the ADA compliance that we needed to get with the shared use path. And so we'd be able to get folks from the shared use path all the way up to the community center, to the middle school, and those sorts of things with the facilities we have proposed. So we've thought about a lot of this, and yeah, I understand that any new trips seem like they have the potential to impact your block in a potentially negative way. I live 2 blocks from Alder Street, and we did similar neighborhood greenway treatments on that street. And a lot of folks were concerned about where that traffic was going to go. Is traffic going to go on my street now? Is it going to go 2 blocks away from where it was? Like what's going to happen? And we have noticed no change at all. So it generally, when there is a low volume of traffic, they negotiate very well with other road users. There's just a lot of space to be able to negotiate on an existing street that does not have a lot of traffic and that are not traveling at a high rate of speed.
You know, something we can do, I see that there's some concerns about traffic volume, about speeding on Admiral, is that we could put out hoses. We usually hire Lane County to do that and do a speed and volume study to get an understanding of how fast people are driving and how many vehicles there are per day. So that's something that we can, so you might see hoses out on the street at some point, and those are to help us get an understanding of what the traffic volume and speed are.
And when Rob says hoses, it's a pneumatic tube that has air in it. And when your tires go over it, it pushes that air into a controller boxes, and it basically tells the controller box that there's a count there. Somebody just drove over this. It's not a garden hose or anything. What else you got, Gary?
Continue just concern from the Admiral Street, and I'm just going to read this one and just assume that 5 other people have said pretty much the same thing. We have lived on this street for nearly 15 years, raised our children here. Our kids trick or treat on this street and are able to walk to school. It's always been a quiet, safe, low traffic street. This is going to really impact the level of privacy, safety for our children and families. Most people that travel this street are people who live on this street. It's a dead-end street. This will give access to every Tom, Dick, and Harry to travel through our limited little street.
Yeah, I completely understand that concern. I would wager when you purchased your property, there was a termination of the street. And at some point, folks might have talked about development that may occur south on Admiral. And, that's part of the growing process. What we're proposing is actually pretty low impact. I think it's a shared use path. And so while it does generate users in the form of people walking and bicycling, as I mentioned, I don't think it would have that much impact on traffic. And for folks, and I live by a bunch of active transportation facilities. I really enjoy it. I see people that I know out there using them. You'll see people walking dogs. You might, if you have a dog yourself, you might make friends. I think it's less intrusive than a lot of folks think it will be, but I understand that it will be different. And I think that that's true. And if we need to do etiquette campaigns along the shared use path, we have been doing that along the river path. There are sometimes conflicts between users. So if there are people who are driving illegal vehicles like gasoline powered bicycles on the shared use path, which does happen, we see them on the West Bank path from time to time, and they end up in the neighborhoods. These are sorts of things that obviously we don't want to see. And so we generally address those at that time, but it's very rare occurrence. And so we generally say this is a net benefit for a neighborhood. Generally, connectivity is thought to be a net positive, and then connecting folks who live on Admiral to the riverbank pass system, I think is also potentially a positive. That is, as I mentioned, one of the jewels of our entire park system in the city of Eugene. And so I understand that it will be different, and I understand there could be some concerns about that. And we generally If there are specific problems that do occur, we address those as they arise and see if there are any ways that we can make those lessened or eliminate them altogether.
And Reed, vehicles are not allowed on the shared use path there, right?
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
Now there could be a park vehicle from time to time, you know, just to do cleanup or path maintenance, that sort of thing. But generally we would, and this is something we would talk about in the public engagement process is, you know, what do we put at the end of the path? Sometimes we'll put bollards there to make sure that people don't drive into that space, those sorts of things. And generally our parks are the only folks who have keys to those, sometimes, or emergency services folks, so you could get fire in there too if there was a brush fire or something. But generally it's really difficult to get an automobile into the path network.
Question about Delta Sand and gravel. Did they receive permission to continue the gravel pit for giving up land for this path?
I can take that one, Reed. So I don't believe they've gone through the full permitting process yet to expand the area where they're allowed to mine for gravel. If anyone knows other than that, you know, feel free to write that in the chat. But I've talked, it's been probably at least a year now, to Stan Pickett, the general manager, and it felt like they kept pushing off what they needed to do in order to apply to the county. And I think maybe the city also they both had to approve it. We were very clear with Delta Sand and Gravel that there's no quid pro quo, that donating land does not impact whether or not they're going to get a permit. I'd like to just address sort of a broader issue here, which is that, first of all, I think as Reed said, your feelings of, you know, everyone's entitled to their feelings and your concerns. We may not 100% agree with your concerns, but your feelings are valid. And we understand that it's right now a very quiet neighborhood street. As Reed said, we don't think that just adding people walking and biking will make a huge difference in that regard, but for you personally, it may feel very different. We are charged with creating a transportation network for everything within the urban growth boundary. So our transportation system plan addresses the entire UGB, and our charge by the city and the state is to create a network that people can get around, not just by driving, but by using other modes of transportation. And the number of requirements and adopted plans at the city and state level to basically point us even more in this direction are increasing rather than decreasing. And so we have even more pressure on us to deliver an active transportation network and increase the percentage of people who get around by modes other than driving. And so this is just part of building out that network so that people from around different neighborhoods within the UGB have alternatives to driving. And like Reed said, we will, you know, when we get further along in the planning process, we will look at some different options. We're not making any promises about choosing one street versus another. Another thing we can talk about is I saw somebody saying we should deal with Hunsaker first. We actually also received a grant to complete the improvements on Hunsaker. So I don't know what exactly the eastern terminus will be, but we will be building sidewalks and bicycle and stormwater facilities on Hunsaker and turning it into what we call a complete street, a street that people can use again by every mode. And so I think that's scheduled for construction in 2024. And that's a collaboration between the city and the county. I'll stop at that for now.
You two weren't at the last SCCO meeting, but a comment here. It was said at the end of the last SCCO meeting that Zane Street cannot be used for the path because it is not in the UGB, the urban growth boundary. However, the current published UGB map shows that it is. Can you address that? I can't.
Well, we could certainly look at a new version, the latest version of the map, but I will say we do have park facilities that are outside the UGB. And so that doesn't necessarily matter. For example, you know, the like I mentioned, Admiral is not currently a City of Eugene street, and we talked with them about jurisdictional transfer and whether or not they would require that. And, you know, it's a future discussion about all of those things. But we have built things outside of the UGB before. Rob, I don't know if there's anything specifically in the grant that says we couldn't do that. But we would just need to know the boundaries before we, you know, really entertain that or did a environmental analysis. And again, as I mentioned, that probably won't happen for a couple of years, but we can certainly look at the map and figure that out.
Question, I am curious if people who live on Wilkes feel unduly burdened by the path there. It feels to me that the level of use there would be similar to what we would see on this new path.
No, because I'm already on. I already on Zoom. I am already on Zoom. So can watch it in the room.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know how am I better.
Okay, I'm not, yeah. Getting back to this, the need for sidewalk, just can you again go over why Admiral needs the sidewalk on one side, while many other streets don't have them ending at the, not sure what that last word's supposed to be there.
So again, we put that in there as a placeholder in the budget, and we're saving that for the public involvement process so that we can talk whether or not that sidewalk would be necessary. But I can tell you where we generally connect a shared use path to an on-street environment, folks who are walking want to continue to be separated from automobile traffic, and that's where sidewalks are generally requested. Now, we haven't confirmed that here, and so that may not be the case, and that's not something we have to do as part of this project. So we put it in there so that we were anticipating a demand for sidewalks and separation of pedestrian users. That may not come to fruition. So we'll have to wait and see how folks respond to that. And as I mentioned, we haven't done the environmental analysis either to figure out, you know, if there's a better side of the street, if there's a better way to connect those things. What do the crossings look like once you get up to River Loop? What side of the street should that be on based on what's adjacent to it? So all of those things I think need to be determined yet, but we don't have to have a sidewalk as part of this. But I think a lot of folks will feel more comfortable if there was.
And just to add to that, I mean, somebody commented earlier that people drive 40 miles an hour going to pick up their kids on Admiral. So if there's a real safety issue there, then that'll be part of the conversation. Because obviously we don't want people walking and get, you know, in an environment like that, walking in where the traffic is.
We have three questions / comments on issues with the unhoused. How will the city address the potential for unhoused persons living in vacant fields, leased tree farms, and other private properties outside the city limits? Concern about stealing and robbery, and so just, I'm sorry, but that's absolutely the norm along bike paths. And is there any data to on property crime prevalence related to path proximity?
I will say that the encampment strategy actually gets easier with this alignment because adjacent property would be, you know, Sand and Gravel, which is a private entity who can abate things immediately, you know, as soon as they realize them. Where a lot of encampments occur is in these gray areas. So a lot of them occur adjacent to railroad tracks, where ODOT Rail is the authorizing agency, and they just don't have the jurisdiction to get everywhere all of the time. A lot of these, you know, also like in Maury Jacobs Park, adjacent to adjacent to highways, there's some gray area there where ODOT is technically in charge of those spaces. That doesn't happen up here. Up here we've got private property next to what I think would be a transportation easement, and we would keep that easement fairly narrow, wide enough to develop the facility, and that is it. And so enforcement actually becomes a lot easier than on most of our system, because they're not adjacent to other parklands, they're adjacent to private properties. The city has been working very hard on this, and I know we all want to see this just done. And why do we still continue to have encampments everywhere? But Rob and I have both been briefed on where the new sites are. Rob, I forget the name of what we call those, but basically the sheltered sites where folks can legally set up encampments, where they are taken care of, where they're given a standard of care. And it's understanding that's what's required for, to basically displace folks. If we displace folks and don't give them a place to go, they end up elsewhere in the system. And so our strategy has been to give them a reasonable place to be while they evaluate their mental health, and give them other long-term housing options. And so we've been building a lot more of those, and more of those are scheduled to come online. And so that problem, I think, is getting addressed. I know it's not going fast enough for anybody. I'm included in that, but I think it's the best way to go, because it ensures that we'll have some. It ensures that the folks who are susceptible to being helped are getting helped, and we have a way to do that. We're dedicating a lot of resources to that. So we all hope that problem will subside in the very near future, because we've invested so much in the outcome of folks who need a little bit extra help. And we've prepared sites to allow them to have a space to figure things out. So ostensibly, we should have fewer encampments along the riverbank path system very soon. And we all look forward to when that will happen.
Okay. Continued comments from the people on Admiral. Just, if nobody wants this, does it matter to the city?
It's of course it matters. We want to build things that people want, and so we're going to work very hard when the process starts in earnest again in 2023 to make sure that we are addressing people's concerns. And if the concern is simply that they don't want the thing to exist, then that isn't necessarily enough reason for us not to do a thing. What we can address is lighting. I don't want lighting coming in my back window. We can address that. I don't want, cars operating on the path. We can address that. Those sorts of things. We think that there's a better street for this to be on. Let's look at that. Those sorts of things, I think, are still things that we can certainly address. Whether or not there's going to be a path is not something at this point that we're entertaining. There is going to be a connection built. We simply haven't decided where that's going to occur. And so there's still a lot of opportunity for folks who are worried about this to participate in a process and end up with an outcome that I think that they can be happy with.
Okay, jumping back to the issue of problems with the unhoused, who would enforce those problems, potential problems? And I'm guessing that refers to, we're split up so much between city and county, and the city, the county's already put in part of this. This would be the city's portion of it, and it's it's a quilt out here. It's 2 blocks over, it's county. 2 blocks over, it's city.
Yeah, and Kate asked this too, is like, should we have somebody from EPD there? At this point, again, I hate deferring this because folks have a lot of energy around this right now, but we have a lot of projects stacked up in front of this one, so that I think when we start this process in 2023, we'll have clearer answers to all of this stuff, and hopefully this idea of the unhoused is one that we've solved, and I have faith that that is going to be the case. I also hope that we will have better enforcement opportunities, and at that point, I think we need to have EPD at the table to address these concerns. But at this point, you know, I think it's hard to answer that with any certainty.
Okay. You mentioned that the path is designed to take folks down Alameda to Wilkes at the middle school because it would be too dangerous for them to go from River Loop 1 near the park to the school. Then later in the meeting, you said it would be used to get folks to the park. So shouldn't improvements be made to the stretch of Wilkes River Loop 1 from the school to the park first?
I think that the path that's on Wilkes on the north side should be extended to the community park east of the middle school. So ideally, the path extends north. It goes on the street network, wherever that is, the way that we have it drawn now, that would be Admiral. It crosses River Loop 1, it's on Alameda, it crosses Wilkes at the existing crosswalk. And it joins up with the Wilkes path on that north side, which terminates at Alameda. It continues to go east then. So we're building a new path extension on that north side of Wilkes, which would then tie right into that community park. I think that's the best outcome. And I talked to Parks and Open Space today about that. And it's like, we need to think about these connections to not only the school site, which I know they want to do. Most of the community park, if you don't know, is happening north, at least in phase 1 is happening north of the middle school site. And so that's really the connection they're concerned about. And then there will be some temporary stuff happening just to the east of the middle school. But I still think that there's a vital need for a connection on that north side of Wilkes, and it should terminate at the community park. That would be ideal. But there may be a reason why we would want to, route folks on River Loop 1 instead, and then direct them directly up to Wilkes. I don't know what the answer is at this point. I think everything's on the table, but in my mind, the ideal solution would be to continue to extend that shared use path on Wilkes to the east.
A little different here. As I recall, when I planned my fence, there is a certain easement on the street on all properties in Lane County in that area. The local government and utilities can develop that are for sidewalks, etc.
That's called the right of way. So that's the public right of way. And that's what we're talking about when, so that's where the utilities generally live. That's where sidewalks generally live. If the street needs to be expanded because there's a lot of traffic happening or something, they can expand up to that right of way. And where that comes in conflict with private property owners is where the private property owner has planted a garden in the public right of way, and now there's going to be a sidewalk there, or they planted a tree there and there needs to be a stormwater facility built or dug up because it's actually under the ground. Those are the conflicts we see pretty often. The right of way extends, I think, a little bit further than a lot of folks realize on each side of the street, but I haven't looked this one up specifically because it's Lane County, and I'm not sure if our records are completely accurate. In the city of Eugene, our right of way tends to be about 60 feet. So a typical neighborhood street is about 34, 36 feet wide, and the right of way is about 60. So it does go a little bit farther than a lot of folks think. But we work real hard not to impact existing property owners' property unless there's a need to do that. And so we've routed things around properties. We've redirected sidewalks. We've built them out in the street so that they don't disrupt private property. That continues to be our preference. We don't want to disrupt the neighborhood character with a project that is meant to improve the place. So we work very hard to make sure that we're not doing that. And if we do impact somebody's property in some way, that we work with that property owner to put things back in a manner that they're actually happy with, and not just leave it missing or leave a gap in something.
Different one. Why does the project summary state the functional class as off-street with no crash history when there are actually 3 street in your plan?
Because we considered this a path project, quite frankly. The streets are already there. They're not connected. The path is what forges this connection. And so it's primarily a path project. And that's where, to be frank, we're going to end up spending the lion's share of the grant money is on the path, because we're going to have to build something where nothing has been built before. And so that takes a lot of permitting, it takes a lot of analysis, takes a lot of design. All of those things take a lot of time. And that's the gist of it. It's a path project that starts and ends on street.
Has there been any conversation about fencing and privacy vegetation requirements where the path runs behind or alongside residential properties?
We have done that on occasion. That's something, again, that we could consider, is how to separate spaces and make sure that people feel like they have defensible space, they have access to the private property. It feels separate from the public realm, which would be the shared use path. We can talk about all of that as part of that design process. At this point, I can't say that we will or will not build them, but it's something we can consider.
Okay, a few more comments about security. The original plan from 2016 published on the Santa Clara Community Organization website states the path will be on Zane. Why was the plan changed to Admiral?
As I mentioned,
Sorry, we did that.
We drew a line from where the Wilkes path terminates, which is essentially Alameda, and then looked south of that path and said, okay, well, if you take Alameda down to Admiral, you end up on the Delta property, and that's the property where we're going to build the shared use path. And so it was the shortest distance between a path project and where we would build another project. Now, it certainly could loop around to Zane, as I mentioned, but we generally wouldn't come that close to a street without connecting to it. So of the recent path projects that are new paths, I don't know if folks in the neighborhood have ever been out to Golden Gardens Park. So that's north of Barger, on the other side of Beltline, so on the west side, and it's south of Clear Lake Road, essentially. So we built a path up there, the Jessen path, and at every one of those streets that terminates, we have a connection to that shared use path. And that's generally how we build paths, so that everybody has access to this community investment. We have limited resources, so when we build things, we make sure that people have access to that facility. I don't think that we would go to Zane without connecting to Admiral. So I think Admiral at some point is going to be connected. The part that we need to figure out is it may or may not have sidewalk. So I think that's the question, and something that we would want to figure out through the public process.
Please, are there any annexation issues here? It's my understanding that annexation is not a goal for any of this, but is that true? And I do recall there was a month ago, there were some concerns about annexation, part, whole, whatever.
Yeah, I had heard that if the city builds a sidewalk, that they want the property where the sidewalk was built to annex into the city. We don't have any policy like that. As I mentioned, we've been talking with Lane County. We may not even take jurisdiction of that street. We might just build a sidewalk, and then it goes, it's on a Lane County facility. And so nothing would change in terms of the property at all. This is a public works project. It's a transportation project. It is not a land use project. And so we do not go through any kind of annexation process for a project like this. We're simply trying to connect point A to point B and do that as efficiently as possible with the funding that we have. And that's why we invariably end up at Admiral. But we can look at that. We can look at other places to connect the path to. But we have a limited amount of money to do that. And so our choices are somewhat limited, but annexation, not part of our project scope at all.
By the shared use path on Wilkes, do you mean the asphalt sidewalk between the street and the field in front of the track?
That's what I mean, yes. The one that's
not clean and is never cleaned off.
Yeah, it should be. So ideally, so if again, we're projecting, we have this great community center and community park next to a middle school. All of this is developed and is a destination. And we've got sort of this crumbling path on the north side of Wilkes that should get rebuilt. And if that is rebuilt, it should be rebuilt as a shared use path. So in my mind, it serves that function now, even though it's not in good repair. Yeah, so I'm referring to that as a shared use path, and I think eventually it should look very much like what gets built at the community park space. So it should just tie right into that and basically look like the same thing. It should look like a shared use path.
And this one's not for you, but along with recording of this meeting, will all the questions asked be published as well? And I will say yes, as long as I save the chat properly. This is the first time I've done this. And then I'm going to read a little comments here. I live on Taito Street. Taito Street is used by many cyclists. It is currently the preferred route for many cyclists. I have to say, I enjoy it. I enjoy waving to the passing cyclists. I enjoy that they wave back. I have enjoyed the friendly conversations I've had with the passerbys. I like that cars have to slow down to take account for people on bikes. On a personal note, I would be sad to see the bike path be moved over one street. I will miss seeing the cyclists. I love the additional paths being added to the current network or bike paths. Bike paths promote healthy lifestyles. They promote a green environment. They promote a connected and social community. The bike paths have even inspired me to get out and enjoy the outdoors. They have been fundamental in my ability to socialize with others in my community. Regarding the sentence found, in the flyer on my doorstep, how will our homes be protected from folks who use the path for the wrong reasons? I am inclined to believe this sentence is referring to a homeless population, though it may also include some other population of people. Living on Taito Street and having ample bike use run through my neighborhood, I've not seen an increase in any type of individual who would cause damage to my home. To the few who have concerns and live on Admiral Street, I understand your concerns. The plans for the new bike path bring change. I hope that my experience with the cyclists traveling through Taito Street and in front of my home can help resolve some of your concerns. Thank you. Question just popped up after that. Is there any research-based info available showing association of bike paths with increased crime? I guess we addressed that a while ago, I think.
Yeah, we've not seen anything. I think the major organization that does that type of research is the Rails to Trails. And they're a trail advocacy organization, but this question does come up quite a bit. And so they have looked into it. I've never seen data that draws a link between increased crime and the existence or prevalence of shared use paths. What I have heard is increase in property value as a result. And that comes, directly from connectivity and, desirability of locations, because they do have access to things where people want to be. They want to be near the riverbank path. They want to be near community centers, those sorts of things. And so those data are, I think, getting rather aged now, but I think that that's still the case. We could look into additional data because I haven't looked at that in a while, but I've never seen anything on increased crime. And I do look for those data periodically.
Okay, at this point, if you have any questions that haven't come up yet, please enter them, because there are no more in there. And I'm just going to put a plug in for, if you don't get our newsletter via you can get it through Twitter, you can get it through Facebook, you can get it via email. What happens is we post a blog with topics like this. Now is one of our members works at the Looper Cemetery. We do work parties at the Santa Clara Community Garden. We have emergency preparedness notices, blood drives, things like that. Probably about 20 a month. It's not overwhelming, but I just recommend going to our website, and I'll post it here at the end, and signing up. And there's 3 ways to sign up. You can click on the Facebook or Twitter logos or just sign up. Okay, popped up a few more. Do you hear from neighbors who are living along the Ruth Bascom pathways?
Sometimes there are areas along the entire shared use path network where there are problems. There are many more areas where there are none. What we do is we will contact the Eugene Police Department and the community policing officers and talk with property owners about crime prevention through environmental design. Often in that conversation, we uncover things like their recyclables are not covered or locked, those sorts of things. And so they do draw a crowd. Maybe there's a lack of lighting, so they're, people feel very comfortable walking into people's yards, those sorts of things. So we have those conversations pretty frequently. I think overall, those cases are few, but they do occur.
And Cody, you're right. I didn't do this one. I missed it. I don't believe it was addressed. Do you have an estimated usage for this extended path? Basically, how many more people traveling down Admiral?
That's really difficult to calculate, like really difficult. I think a lot of that, and it will change when the community park is there, and it changes seasonally as well. So if there are folks living south of the middle school who go to the middle school, then in fall and in spring, you see increases in ridership and walking, those sorts of things on our shared use path network. And then the community path or the community center isn't there, the community park isn't there yet, so that will be changing. This is sort of the end of the path network. We sort of noticed that north of the Greenway Bridge, which is the bridge from Maury Jacobs Park to Valley River Center, ridership tends to go down the further north that you go. That's not unusual. The Fern Ridge Path, which travels east and west south of 11th, the further west you go, you get less ridership. The Beltline Path, the further north you go, you get less ridership. So at the end of paths, you get fewer people out there. And when there's more stuff to be seen, like the Greenway Bridge that I mentioned, there's a mall on one side, the other side is Maury Jacobs Park. And then you get down into the River Play area. That's our most popular shared use segment. And this is the West Bank Path that I'm talking about. And so this is the extension of the West Bank Path, but unless you have a destination at that far north end, generally people will not ride up that far unless they are out for a recreational ride. Numbers, I don't know. I could take a count. I've been meaning to get a count on the I-5 path because I think it's very similar to this one in that it just sort of goes to the north and provides some access. And it's a newer path. And people, I think, are constantly discovering it. I keep talking to folks who have been riding the community for decades who don't know it's out there. It goes all the way from Chad Drive down to North Garden Way. There's a whole path out there. So I don't know, but it's not thousands. Our most utilized segments in the network are maybe 1,500 people per day. This is going to be much less than that. I would say on an order of at least 5 or 6 times less. I would hope that, as I mentioned, during the shoulder seasons and when school is in session, we do get some good ridership, over 100 or more. And then, if there's not school in session and before there's a community park, I think it may drop off a little bit. But our long-term goals are to give more people access to these type of facilities so that they could decide to ride more, and that would be ideal. I'd love for there to be too much traffic on a shared use path. We haven't had that problem yet anywhere in the system, and so it'll be big enough to accommodate anything that we've experienced along the shared use path network for sure. And I don't think we're talking about big numbers because, again, the destinations just aren't there to generate that amount of traffic.
Is there any place else in the current path system where 3 streets, the combined length of Admiral, River Loop 1, and Alameda are part of the path system?
I haven't done measurements. Does that person know how long that is? I mean, how long is Copping Street on the West Bank path? I mean, that's some on street. The South Bank path ends at the university. You have to go onto the Millrace path and then go over to the Knickerbocker Bridge. That's a very long segment. I would wager it's longer than what we're talking about here. So this is not unheard of. We do have a couple areas where a shared use path matches up with a street, generally a local street. And generally we hear about those on-street segments. People would prefer that the path go all the way, and I understand that. But where we have existing neighborhoods, we do our best to make sure that that they are maintained as is, and that we are also providing the accommodation that we can through any kind of intervention that we can provide, in so long as it's not disrupting the current uses that are there. So yeah, I think there are examples. As I mentioned, the Millrace Drive from basically what is Agate Street, sort of north of Franklin, which goes all the way over to Walnut Street. That's a rather big segment. On the West Bank path, there's Copping. There's also another smaller segment of on street. There are a few. Is
the section behind Lane County Fairgrounds Friendly Street? Someone typed in.
Yeah, exactly. So
Pretty big.
Yeah, the Fern Ridge path basically starts at 15th. Yeah, so once you get to Friendly, between Friendly and Van Buren there, that's on street. So the Fern Ridge is on street for a little bit there. There are a few segments like that.
Okay, I'm a parent who raised her child at the northern end of Santa Clara and transported by bicycle everywhere. To connect to the rest of town and get where children need to go, we have to ride on River Road. It's treacherous and one of the deadliest streets in our community. I only wish this was built sooner. My child is now 23. I still commute by bike and would love to use this. A concern here, because of secluded nature of our streets and the surrounding fields, we've had many instances of theft and vandalism. We have no evidence that it is the unhoused, but we are concerned that the path will increase these problems. Statement in support: I will be very excited to use this path. And that is it. So thank you for all of your questions, concerns, comments, chat entries. I know that's not the easiest thing in the world.
I'll just put out a reminder that if you want to be on the interested parties list, that'll be shared with the city so they can use that to keep you apprised of any notifications, changes, or opportunities for input. Put your name and your email address in the chat tonight, and we'll make sure that they get that. Okay, was there anything else for Reed or Rob Innerfeld?
I think it's been mentioned that I think in the newsletter, my name, my phone number, my email address will all be provided. If you want to talk one-on-one about specific concerns, we can do that. Drop me a line or give me a call and let's talk through this. I don't want anybody to feel like this is a bad project, or that you haven't been heard, or that we're just trying to do something and we don't care about the outcome. We care very much. We're doing what we've been told to do based on the planning that we've done and what our elected leaders have adopted as part of our long-term transportation strategy. So we're in a position where we want to try to make folks as happy as possible as we implement those plans, and where we can make changes to get that outcome, we're going to do that. So don't be shy about that. Let me know if there are things that we can do that will improve outcomes for you. And when we get to the planning process, we'll certainly take that into consideration. So thank you very much. I enjoyed this.